This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
I'm beyond delighted to be here and want to thank the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii and Laura Lee and Marie and Alieska and all of you for coming out. Maui is absolutely gorgeous. But anyway, let me just say a bit about myself. Of course, I do work for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. It's absolutely the ultimate dream job. It's beyond any, my wildest expectation. I've been working for PETA for about 6 years, and it really is just a pleasure to be doing something that I feel is so important and that I like so much. My father is a professor at Rutgers, and he has on his wall, and he sent me a copy of it, so now I have it on my bulletin board as well, a quotation, and it says, "Find a job you love, and you'll never have to work a day in your life." And I feel like that really captures the work that I do for PETA. On the one hand, it's oftentimes very dispiriting. It can be very sad, but at the same time, it's just so powerful to feel that you're making a difference. I became a vegan about 15 years ago at a small granola crunchy school in the cornfields of Iowa called Grinnell College. And at Grinnell, everybody arrives about a week early if your first year, and you figure out what you're going to do. So, if you want to be on the losingest football team in the history of losing football teams, you can turn up and do that at Grinnell. Or you can be on the cross-country team, which does just a little bit better than the football team. And all of the other organizations also have their sort of pre-meeting thing, and you figure out what it is you're going to do. So I joined a group called Poverty Action Now, and we organized fasts for Oxfam International and that sort of thing. And I also went on the weekends to the homeless shelter in Des Moines, Iowa. And we were all very surprised to learn that Des Moines, Iowa has homeless, but they do. And we organized trips to the homeless shelter, so we did both domestic poverty relief and international poverty relief. And I joined a group called Latin American Support Organization, and Latin American Support Organization was involved at this point back in 1987 in doing things focusing on Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and protesting things that the United States was doing there. We also were active Latin American Support Organization just because we didn't have an organization looking at apartheid in South Africa. The Lasso Group was also working on that sort of thing. And even then, back in 1987, everybody who was running these organizations, remarkably enough, everybody was a vegan. All of the organizers, as was everybody on the cross-country team at Grinnell College. And now, about a quarter of the school, as of last year, a quarter of the school is vegan. About half of the entrees served at Grinnell College are vegan. This is the Granola Crunchy School of Granola Crunchy Schools. But in any event, even then, peer pressure could make a person go vegan. And I talked to people about reasons for veganism. I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet. How many people have read Diet for a Small Planet? Most people have read it. So you know the basic gist of the argument. And her argument is pretty simple. It's that environmentally and for global hunger reasons, people should be eating low on the food chain. Environmentally, it's inefficient and polluting to be cycling grains and soy through animals. And from a global hunger perspective, while so many people are starving to death, it's not reasonable that we would cycle grains and soy through animals. And as somebody who is very involved in hunger issues, and as somebody who considers himself to be an environmentalist, I got my high school in Oklahoma to begin a recycling program. These issues were very important to me, so it was a pretty easy sell from that point forward when the people on campus who I really admired were also vegans, and I adopted a vegan diet. And that's what I want to talk a bit more about. One thing that I want to preface my comments with is that as I look out and I see, Laura Lee, and I see so many people that probably could do this talk better than I can do this talk, probably more adept at this sort of thing. I think it's valuable for all of us. I certainly find it valuable to read these things again and again and again. I mean, I know the arguments, you know the arguments, but society is so strong in attempting to convince us that what we know to be true is not true, that I think that it's valuable for all of us to still hear these arguments. It's valuable for us to read these sorts of books and to continue to affirm ourselves in our understanding that, as just one example, animals are not automatons. Certain things aren't okay, and so on and so forth. So I appreciate, especially since so many of you have already seemed to know the arguments, I appreciate that you turned up. I also think that it's important to continue to solidify ourselves in these sorts of understanding, in this sort of an understanding. What I want to talk about is veganism as the only diet for a small planet. Apologies to Francis Moore Lepage. And I think that, as many of us are probably aware, there are about as many reasons to be a vegan as there are vegans, right? But I think that they do tend to fall into 5 key categories, and I'll attempt to distill those fairly quickly and then toss it open for questions. And those are the health reasons, the environmental reasons, the human rights reasons, the animal rights reasons, and the animal welfare reasons. And I think there is a distinction between going vegan for animal rights reasons and going vegan for animal welfare reasons, although the distinction probably is oftentimes blurred. I think it's one that's worth listening to or thinking about at least just a little bit. The health reasons for adopting a vegan diet, probably since you guys have William Harris in Honolulu and you have Michael Clapper here in town, and you have a virtuoso vegan chef in Brooke, who is also Alka's and my host. You probably know the health reasons for veganism, but I think that they can't be overstated because it's a remarkable, in my opinion, the degree to which society, because the meat and dairy interests are so powerful, the degree to which society attempts to convince us that meat, dairy products, eggs are absolutely essential to being healthful. You're going to waste away into nothing and find yourself in an early grave if you don't consume, plenty of chicken and fish and low-fat milk or whatever else. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'll just talk about this briefly and say that the biggest killers in this country, as we all know, are heart disease and cancer. And both of them are caused by eating meat, dairy, and egg products. And of course, other problems that plague us, like obesity and diabetes and osteoporosis, so many other problems caused by eating meat, dairy, and eggs. The 2 researchers in human history who have unclogged people's arteries, 2 people have ever unclogged people's arteries. Up until about 15 years ago, it was assumed that as we got older, our arteries clogged, right? If you didn't get hit by a bus, or a meteor didn't hit you, or you didn't, drown while swimming and the riptides whisked you away, eventually your arteries would clog up, and either your brain would stop and you'd have a stroke, or your heart would stop and you'd have a heart attack. Enter Dr. Dean Ornish, about 15 years ago, publishes for the first time the evidence that, in fact, nobody has to die of atherosclerosis. This is something that is self-inflicted. And Ornish and Esselstyn, the 2 researchers who have actually unclogged people's arteries, they don't just prevent it. They don't just make people, as Esselstyn says, they don't just make them heart attack proof. They actually unclog the arteries of people who have advanced stages of this, of people who have had multiple cardiac arrests. They take these people and they unclog their arteries. And both of them use a low-fat vegan diet to do it. Absolutely unbelievable. Kills about half of men in this country, almost half of women in this country. None of them have to die from atherosclerosis. The number 2 killer is cancer. Because if you go into the grocery store and you get all of the meat, all of the dairy, all of the eggs, what you will get is a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol. What you will not get is a single gram of fiber or complex carbohydrates. You can eat all of the fish, all of the dairy, all of the eggs, all of the meat. You will get no complex carbohydrates, you will get no fiber, you will get megadoses of saturated fat, cholesterol, and animal protein. The saturated fat and cholesterol clog up the arteries, go into your heart or your brain, and give you a heart attack or a stroke, 1 in 3 killers in this country. The animal protein both causes and spurs on cancer cell growth, according to T. Colin Campbell, the foremost epidemiological scientist in the world. He did the China study, and he says nothing is so carcinogenic as animal protein. And if you look at the research that's done by the cancer societies, the American Cancer Society or the American Institute of Cancer Research or the World Health Organization or the Royal Cancer Society, all of them, they've all gotten together and gotten their little book together. And they will all tell you that as much cancer is caused by what we eat as by smoking. As much cancer is caused by diet as by smoking. And that's the reason, as you're flipping through Newsweek or you're driving down the road and you see the billboard and it tells you to be careful of what you eat or you'll get cancer, right? Well, no, those billboards don't exist. Why don't those billboards? I'm trying to see if anybody's awake. Anyway, no, it's interesting. If you go to any of their websites or you read any of their pamphlets on nutrition, they're not publicizing this because there's not money in publicizing this. But if you go to any of their websites, they'll tell you that as much cancer is caused by diet as is caused by smoking. And every single time, their top 2 recommendations, all of those organizations that I mentioned and all of them that we've looked at, they all have the same top 2 recommendations on the basis of distilling all of the research that's been done, all of the nutritional research that's been done on cancer. The number one piece of advice that they have is eat more plant-based foods. The number 2 piece of advice that they have is eat fewer animal-based foods. In case people don't know what that means, they spell it out for you. Eat fewer, it says fish and dairy products and eggs and meat. For some reason, all of these nutritionists still think that fish is not meat. But nevertheless, they do spell it out for you. The top 2 recommendations, more plant-based foods, fewer animal-based foods. Top 2 recommendations from all of the cancer charities, as well as like the World Health Organization when they're looking at these issues. Obesity, of course, the same thing. You can certainly be an unhealthful vegan. You can be a vegan and have a heart attack. You can go in and eat nothing but French fries and potato chips, and that will clog your arteries just as effectively. But in the history of medical science, nobody with a cholesterol level below 150 has yet had a heart attack. And the average vegan cholesterol level is about 128. So the average ovo-lacto-vegetarian has a cholesterol level of about, I think, 180, something like that. And the average meat eater has a cholesterol level of just over 200. So the American Medical Association might tell you you're doing just fine with a cholesterol level of 200, but people with an equal cholesterol level are dropping like flies. And it seems like something you should probably be concerned about. And the third reason for adopting a vegan diet is for human rights reasons. I have a very close personal friend, a Jesuit priest by the name of John Deere. He's a peace and justice activist, and he's actually just written a pamphlet for PETA, Christianity and Vegetarianism, and he basically makes these same 5 key points, but he puts them in a Christian context, and it's very powerful, I think. But he originally adopted a vegan diet for human rights reasons. He adopted a vegan diet after reading Diet for a Small Planet and realizing that we have about 1.3 billion people on the globe, 1 in 5 who isn't eating enough. 1 in 5 people on the globe is not eating enough. 800 million of them, according to the United Nations, are in nutritional deficit. Nutritional deficit, that's a euphemism. They're starving, right? And 40 million of them every year actually do starve to death. 40 million people every single year die from starvation-related causes. In the meantime, if you look at the relationships, the agricultural relationships, Latin America to the United States, Sub-Saharan Africa to the European Union, what you find is that in addition to exporting an awful lot of meat and dairy products, there are very few rich people eat this stuff and then they export the rest to Europe or the United States or Canada. They're also exporting vast quantities of grain and soy to be fed to agricultural animals so that the rich few can eat these products. And that actually happened in the 2 most well-known famines of recent history, back in Ethiopia in the mid-'80s. Throughout the entire famine in Ethiopia, where millions of people died, they were exporting soy to the European Union to feed to agricultural animals so that the rich Europeans could eat this food. And throughout the entire famine in Somalia in the early 90s, I was actually a vegan at the time. I was reading the Washington Post. There was no cover-up. Throughout the entire famine, there were lush soy crops in Somalia that were being exported to the European Union. If you want to be an environmentalist, you have to be a vegan. You're voting with your pocketbook. You're voting with what you put on your plate every time you sit down to eat. The fourth reason to adopt a vegan diet, and I think that I'll go animal welfare and then animal rights. The fourth reason to adopt a vegan diet, and I think this is the one that gets most people, or at least that most people use to stay vegan. And I think it's certainly the one that got my parents. My parents are not animal rights activists. My father is Joe pro-vivisection, among other things. And he's a dean at Rutgers, so he has a lot of friends who are vivisectionists, refuses to accept that it's not going to find a cure for AIDS and a cure for cancer, tomorrow. But in any event, both of my parents have adopted a vegan diet for straight animal welfare reasons. It's a fact. If you do not want to support the gratuitous abuse of animals, if you do not want to support the gratuitous abuse of animals, you have to adopt a vegan diet. Most of us, most people in society, when the polls are done, most people say, yeah, I'm an animal lover. I do care about animal suffering. The reality is the way that animals suffer on factory farms, the way that they suffer in slaughterhouses is so beyond anything that any of us can easily contemplate that we really have to, if we wouldn't do these things, if we wouldn't support this sort of abuse, we have to adopt a vegan diet. And normally at this point I show a video that PETA put together. It's called Meet Your Meat. And at the end it says, are you really that hungry? And it gives the website and it gives our toll-free number for our vegetarian starter kit. But we don't have a TV VCR, so I'll just tell you a little bit about it. Everything on the video is standard agricultural practice. Everything on the video is perfectly legal. And that's an important point. Things that you could not legally do to a dog or a cat, if they're standard agricultural practice, it's perfectly acceptable to do them to a fish or a chicken or a turkey or a pig or a cow. Perfectly acceptable. And the level of abuse, from the moment these animals are born to the moment these animals die, the level of abuse is absolutely beyond anything that most of us can imagine. The animals are genetically bred so that they grow much more quickly than they would naturally. And chickens grow 7 times as fast, their upper bodies, as they did 25 years ago. But their lungs can't keep up, and their hearts can't keep up, and their limbs can't keep up, so they suffer from massive rates of lung collapse and heart failure and crippling. You go into a modern chicken barn today, when the animals are fewer than 2 months old, because they're all shipped to slaughter at 6 weeks for males and 7 weeks for females, and they're taking a day off that every year, the scientists. You go into one of these barns just before the animals are going to be shipped to slaughter, and they're not moving. They're just all sitting there because their upper bodies are so heavy that all of these animals are in chronic, unmitigated misery. And they can't move, right? Because of genetic breeding of the animals. And that's true of all of these animals. They're not doing as well with it for cattle. It's only like the last year in cattle's lives when this sort of misery is inflicted upon them. But with pigs, with chickens, with egg-laying hens, and with dairy cows, they're in chronic pain as a result of their bodies being pushed to produce beyond anything that would be natural. And the only reason that it doesn't kill them to be pushed to produce so much is that they're drugged up. They're loaded down with antibiotics and hormones. 70% of the antibiotics that we produce in this country, 70% are used on animals who are raised for food. And it's not because they're sick, it's because they're going to drop over dead if they're not all dosed up on drugs. And that's reality. Hens are giving about 3 to 4 times as many eggs as they did just 50 years ago. Cows are giving more than 4 times as much milk as they did just 25 years ago. Imagine a human mother giving 4 times as much milk as she would naturally. These animals, these are dairy industry statistics and USDA statistics. These are all industry statistics. And so they're giving 4 times as much milk. 50% of the herd has mastitis, which is a painful udder infection. 50% are suffering from mastitis. At slaughter, according to the USDA, 40% of dairy cattle are lame by the time they reach the slaughterhouse. More than 100,000 of them per year can't walk off the backs of the transport trucks when they arrive at the slaughterhouse. 100,000 dairy cows, downer cows, every single year. And that leaves aside the 15 to 20% of dairy animals who don't even live to be 2 years old. 15 to 20%. It's by far the highest percentage of animals who die from the stress of the conditions that they're living through. 15 to 20% of dairy cows don't even live their first 2 years so that they can start producing milk. The level of abuse in the dairy industry is mirrored in all of these other industries. And that doesn't even take into account the veal connection. Because cows give milk for the same reason all mammals give milk. They give milk for their babies. Well, we take their babies away from them, 10 million animals a year, a byproduct of the dairy industry. We take their babies away from them, and about 1 million of them per year we cram into veal crates. 100% of veal calves, 100% of them are the babies of dairy cows. So if you're consuming dairy products, you're also promoting the veal industry, in addition to promoting the gratuitous abuse of the animals. who are on these factory farms and shipped to slaughter at a fraction of their natural lifespan. A quarter of the dairy herd every year is shipped to slaughter, a third of them in California. But 1 in 4 dairy cows is shipped to slaughter every single year because their bodies are so worn out. All the calcium has been leached from their bones. Off they go to slaughter. 100% of them can't even walk off the backs of the transport trucks. This sort of relationship exists for all these animals. Their bodies are mutilated. Cows and pigs are castrated without painkillers. Cows have their horns ripped out of their heads without painkillers. Pigs have their teeth, the ends of their teeth, ripped off. Imagine that. Imagine taking pliers with no painkillers and ripping the ends of your teeth off. They chop their tails off. It's an appendage. It's like chopping your fingers off. They sear the beaks off of chickens with a hot blade. Any of these practices done to a dog or a cat would be illegal and would land people in prison for felony animal cruelty. Any of these practices. If somebody's eating meat or they're eating dairy or they're eating eggs, they're promoting animal cruelty. And for me, I ask the question, what does it mean to have integrity? What does it mean to be an ethical person? Surely one thing that it means is that we ask the question, why? Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Doesn't it mean to have integrity, to have ethics, that we don't do things that we don't support? That we don't pay other people to do things that we couldn't even watch? Right? How many people in here would want to spend 15 minutes in a slaughterhouse? None of us would want to spend 15 minutes in a slaughterhouse. Certainly none of us would want to work in a slaughterhouse. Really, like Percy Bysshe Shelley said, I don't want to have any part in something I can't write a pleasant poem about. Most of us could, well, if we're poetically inclined, most of us could, spend some time tilling grain. Most of us could pick fruits or could pick vegetables. Most of us could, everything that we consume, except meat and dairy and eggs, we could participate in its cultivation. But if we're consuming meat or we're consuming dairy or we're consuming eggs, we have to ask ourselves, would I want to castrate that pig without painkillers? Would I want to chop the beak off of that hen? It's like chopping the ends of your fingers off. They have sensitive nerve endings in the ends of their beaks because they use their beaks to peck around and, find food and that sort of thing. Would I want to spend 15 minutes even watching what goes on in a slaughterhouse? Paul McCartney says, to the point of being annoying, anybody and everybody who will listen, he says, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everybody would be a vegetarian. I once tried to do that with Paul McCartney's accent. It was a real debacle. But in any event, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everybody would be a vegetarian. I think that's true. If we're going to be ethical people, if we're going to be moral people, each time we sit down to eat, we make a decision about who we are in the world. Do we support cruelty and violence, or don't we? And that leads into the final point, and that's animal liberation, animal rights. I adopted a vegan diet for human rights reasons and ecological reasons about 15 years ago. Didn't even talk about, really, animal welfare particularly. Certainly didn't talk about animal rights. Hadn't read Peter Singer. Hadn't read any of this stuff. Really didn't know about it until I was working in a homeless shelter in a soup kitchen, which I did for about 6 years before I came to PETA. And I came across a book by an Anglican theologian, professor at Oxford University by the name of Andrew Lindsay. And Lindsay wrote this book, Christianity and Animal Rights. And somehow I came across it. And Lindsay's basic thesis is that animals suffer like people suffer, and they can't defend themselves. And consequently, Lindsay posits a preferential option for animals, sort of like you might have heard of the liberation theologians and their preferential option for the poor, the people who can't defend themselves. Lindsay says we should treat animals, God's creatures, in the same way we would treat babies or infants, because they have the same ability to defend themselves, and just like us, they have the same capacity for pain and the same capacity for suffering. And it really sort of blew me away because I hadn't spent that much time thinking about it. I mean, intuitively, I had a sense that animals didn't want to be in the conditions they were in. I grew up in Oklahoma and Minnesota, so I lived on, Big Macs and Dairy Queen for my first 17 years. But I went back to Austin, Minnesota with some regularity. In Austin, Minnesota, so do we have any trivia experts? What is Austin, Minnesota known for? Yeah, Hormel. You're in Hawaii, right? Spam capital of the world. It all comes from Austin, Minnesota, where the two biggest employers in town are the slaughterhouse and the other slaughterhouse. And the name of the high school football team is the Packers. And we just made the front page for asking them to change it. Not much happens in Austin, Minnesota. But in any event, the slaughterhouse and the other slaughterhouse, killing pigs for Hormel. And that's where my grandmother lives, and that's where an uncle and aunt and some cousins all grew up. So I spent a lot of time in Austin, Minnesota, and I've seen the transport trucks. And it gets cold in Minnesota. You guys may not have heard of this, but over on the mainland they got something called snow, and you sometimes have to put on a jacket. But we use them in Minnesota, but they don't give them to the pigs. And it will get to be negative 60, negative 70 degrees, and the slaughterhouse doesn't close, right? The animals just come in, and they come in, and they come in through blizzard conditions, through unbelievable, excruciating pain and suffering. And I saw this, and it certainly concerned me. I mean, I saw the animals on the backs of the transport trucks, and they seemed to be saying, this cannot be happening to me. This cannot be happening to me. And just like everybody else, I have powerful denial mechanisms. It's happening, so it must be all right. Certainly there's nothing I can do about it, right? But it did. It impacted me. And I read Lindsay, and I just thought, this is so true. And subsequently, I came across Peter Singer. Peter Singer, I'm sure everybody knows, he's a philosophy professor. Wow, you get the best. Peter Singer was here about 6 months ago. And he's, I think, well, the New York Times called him the most influential philosopher alive, and certainly nobody even comes in second. He's sort of first, second, and third on the influential philosophers alive. And I think he's also the most profound. Since he's been at Princeton, they've been getting the top rank among the universities for philosophy departments, for graduate departments in philosophy. And came across Singer, and Singer's thesis really is the animal liberation thesis. It's just, if what you're discussing is a being's right to be free from pain and suffering, the only morally relevant variable is your capacity to feel pain and to suffer, right? If what we're discussing is a being's right to be free from pain and suffering, the only morally relevant variable is your capacity to feel pain, your capacity to suffer. And Singer points out what everybody who's taken a physiology course knows: birds, mammals, and fish have basically the same capacity for pain. They have basically the same capacity for suffering. And consequently, the suffering of a chicken is no less important than the suffering of a human being. And that's the basic thesis. And it's also what Lindsay argues. And Alice Walker, in the introduction to a book called The Dreaded Comparison, which compared slavery from when did it start? The 16th century through the 19th century, comparing slavery, human slavery, to what we do to animals today. It's called The Dreaded Comparison. And Alice Walker, the novelist, civil rights activist, feminist, Alice Walker wrote a really remarkable introduction. And within the introduction, she says, the animals of the world exist for their own purposes. They were not created for people any more than blacks were created for whites or women were created for men. The animals of the world exist for their own purposes. They weren't created for us any more than blacks were created for whites or women were created for men. That's the basic thesis of the animal rights movement. And I think that once you start to think about that, and I haven't heard a convincing argument against it, and once you start to think about that and start to think about the fact that what allows us to treat animals as a means to an end is the moral philosophy that might makes right. The law of the jungle. We can do this to pigs, so we're gonna. We can do this to chickens or fish or other animals, so we're going to. The moral philosophy, the moral paradigm of might makes right, it's really the only justification for treating animals the way that we do. But it's morally bankrupt. We don't ascribe to this in our interactions with one another. We don't ascribe to this in global geopolitical, well, we do, but we don't say that we do, in geopolitical relationships. We've pretty much gotten beyond it in human-on-human relationships, but it's the only thing that justifies our treating animals as a means to an end, and it's not acceptable. It's no more justifiable in our interactions with animals than it is in our interactions with one another. And the Nobel laureate, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his novel Enemies, a Love Story, he fled Nazi-occupied Poland, and that's principally what he wrote about in his novels. And Isaac Bashevis Singer said that speciesism, bias on the basis of species, is the purest form of racism. Speciesism is the purest form of racism because it takes the weakest among us and dominates them. And at least with the other isms, you're talking about domination of beings who can attempt to fight for themselves and speak up for themselves. And Isaac Bashevis Singer, who fled the Nazis, said that when it comes to animals, all people are Nazis. And I think it's a powerful statement. 5 independent reasons for adopting a vegan diet, whether you're doing it for your health, whether you're doing it for the environment, or you're doing it for human rights reasons, or you're doing it for environmental reasons, or animal welfare reasons, or animal rights reasons. Was that 6? In any event, it's a lot of reasons for adopting a vegan diet. Each of them, I think, independent justification. Now, Alka and I got the alternative tour of Oahu from Kathy Gogel, who runs Animal Rights Hawaii, and we had the opportunity to talk to a fellow who was raising gamecocks, and we went over to a really just unbelievable, filthy, awful pig pen with all of these breeding pigs and all of these baby pigs, and we talked to the guy there, and we went over to the slaughterhouse, and we talked to the fellow who was running the slaughterhouse, and it can get pretty dispiriting, I think. You know, I look at all of these videos. PETA has constantly undercover investigators taking shots to update Meet Your Meat, and we will actually have a new version of the Meet Your Meat video here in the next week or so. So we're constantly doing this, and we're reviewing books like Slaughterhouse. And for people who haven't read it, please do, Slaughterhouse by Gail Eisnitz. We actually have on goveg.com, if you click on the Slaughterhouse icon, Gail Eisnitz, the author, has allowed us to put on the web everything that I highlighted in my copy of the book. So you can click on excerpts and read all of the gory details from USDA inspectors and slaughterhouse workers and that sort of thing about what goes on. It's easy. And I probably don't have to tell anybody in this room that it's easy to get depressed and it's easy to become despondent. But we shouldn't. We really shouldn't. I think we need to take a historical perspective on how far we've come in what is historically a blink of an eye. Historically, a blink of an eye, less than a finger snap that we've had an animal liberation movement. And think about this, really. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living 2,600 years ago, right? 2,600 years ago. Jesus was around 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago. Muhammad was around about 1,000 years ago. In this country, we got around to saying slave relationships are not acceptable, and we had to fight a war over this. We got around to this 135 years ago. We passed the 13th Amendment. I mean, 135 years ago, that's nothing, right? We got around to saying, hey, maybe women are rational enough to have a say in governance. 82 years ago. Most of us probably have relatives who are alive. 82 years ago, when there was a spirited debate in Congress about whether the Union would dissolve if these irrational creatures, and that's more than half the people in the audience, were given a say in governance 82 years ago. 100 years ago, there did not exist a child abuse law in this country. No state had a child abuse law. You couldn't kill your kid, but anything else went. And my point here isn't to give a history lesson. My point is to say, look how quickly societal consciousness can change. Right? 135 years ago, we held diametrically the opposite view on half a dozen things from what we hold with equal certitude to be, certitude? Is that a word? Equal certainty to be true today. Equal certainty today, the diametrical opposite of what we held to be true 150 years ago on a lot of human rights issues. So look how far we've come. Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, and Andrew Lindsay wrote Christianity and Animal Rights 25 years ago. That really kicked off the animal rights movement. Andrew Lindsay talks about going to anti-vivisection conferences 25 years ago when he wrote his book. 25 years ago? When he wrote his book, talks about going to anti-vivisection conferences. They didn't have vegetarian options. They didn't have vegetarian options at anti-vivisection conferences 25 years ago. Now, I mean, try to get something other than a vegan option. You know, you'd be run out of the room on a rail, and justly so. And justly so. It's interesting, you know, you look at the National Audubon Society talking about factory farming, or the Sierra Club talking about factory farming, or the Natural Resources Defense Council talking about factory farming. You look at the American Dietetic Association talking about all the health benefits of the vegan diet. You look at the World Watch Institute talking about the ecological consequences of raising animals for food. And you look at the amazing number of kids who are growing in their understanding that animals are not automatons, right? I don't know how many, have people here read Stephen Weiss's new book, Drawing the Line, yet? Anybody? Pick it up, it's amazing. He talks about the research that's been done, the lack of research that's been done on animal consciousness. And just looking at the lack of research that's been done even on animal consciousness with regard to dogs and cats. But there is the research being done, and we are learning that animals are not automatons. 10 years ago, the main thing science would say, if you said, my cat is sad, or that pig is unhappy. 10 years ago, science would have said, anthropomorphism, out of here, you fail. 10 years later, they don't. 10 years later, the animal researchers, even the farmed animal welfare researchers, are talking about the fact that, as Temple Grandin says, that's one unhappy cow. People don't like to think about it. Or Ian Duncan at the University of Guelph talking about the social lives of chickens. We know this to be true. Even the Bible has, the hen's love for her brood. We have established in our own parlance the idea of a pecking order, which has to do with the social lives of animals. Chickens have these alpha relationships, just like dogs, right? They have personalities, they have interests. Ask Laura Lee. They have personalities, they have interests. Some of these animals, they like to watch certain TV shows. They don't like other TV shows. They have altruism. They have all of these things that we have, and we've only just learned this or accepted this. Science, at least in the last 10 years, we've come an amazing way that fast. And the snowball is growing. The snowball is growing. Honey and butter. Well, yeah, that's revolting. How do I feel about honey and butter? Well, butter, is a dairy product, and it comes from cows. And it supports animal cruelty for the same reason dairy products do. And one thing to say about the dairy industry is, man, they propagandize, don't they? They have convinced us that nature made a mistake. They've convinced us that nature made a mistake. You've got human mammary secretion, human mother's milk for baby humans, and you've got dog mother's milk for baby dogs, and you've got rat mother's milk for baby rats, and kangaroo mother's milk for baby kangaroos, and cow mother's milk for baby cows. Wait! No. Your bones will break if you don't also consume the mammary secretions of bovines. Right? How absurd is that? They don't have the research to back it up, incidentally. The areas of the world that consume the most cow mammary secretions in the form of dairy products, the areas of the world that consume the most have the highest rates of bone fracture. At Harvard University, they followed 80,000 nurses for 12 years. They found the more milk these women consumed, the higher their rates of osteoporosis. The dairy industry once in human history has fed women more cow's milk. They did 24 ounces of skim milk a day for 2 years. How yucky is that? 24 ounces, 3 8-ounce glasses, 2 years. The women who consumed the milk had twice the bone deterioration of the women who didn't. This was back in 1985. And John McDougall, in the McDougall Program for Women, which is really a phenomenal book, the McDougall Program for Women, he said that's not one they're doing again anytime soon. So you don't need it, If I don't think they even do try to sell butter as something that's good for you. Well, butter is a dairy product, and so you're talking about probably the cruelest of the industries. I guess egg-laying hens is even worse. 18 to 24 months in one of those tiny little cages, and then you're not even good for soup, so they don't take your interest into account, even trying to get you alive to the slaughterhouse. But second would be dairy products. 15 to 20% death rates in the first 2 years. Half of the population having mastitis, a painful udder infection, right this moment. 40% lame by the time they reach the slaughterhouse, and all of them giving an average of 4 times as much milk as they would naturally. And it's an abusive industry. The animals are in chronic pain. Honey, I figure why not give the bees the benefit of the doubt? Which is what Peter Singer says too about bees and crustaceans and other animals. We don't know as much about their pain and stimulus response, but why not give them the benefit of the doubt? You don't need the sugar water. And bees are interesting. They're remarkable animals. To get 1 pound of honey, bees have to make 50,000 flower visits and fly 2 million miles. 2 million miles for a pound of honey, 50,000 flower visits, and we're going to come in there and give them a sugar water that's nutritionally deficient because we like the taste, of the honey that's supposed to sustain them through the winter, not us. Why would we do that? It's sugar water. It's no better for us than cane sugar, and the bees worked for it. Incidentally, Stephen Weiss goes into the sentience of bees in this new book, Drawing the Line, and I haven't gotten to that chapter yet, but I'm excited about it. But in any event, why not give them the benefit of the doubt? And I don't know. I've heard of some bee farms where they don't abuse the animals, but most of the commercial bee farms, the reason that they are completely draped over in those space suits that they use to walk up there and take the comb is because they kill a lot of bees as they're grabbing the combs. They're not worried about killing the drones, and they clip the wings of the queen bees. They clip their wings so they can't fly. All of these industries, they deny the animals everything that's natural to them, including the honey industry. Well, are organic dairy farmers more humane? They're definitely more humane, without a doubt, because they have to keep the animals alive, and The reason that the other dairy cows don't all drop dead is because they're doped up, and so the organic dairy farmers have to treat the animals better. But I've been to an awful lot of organic dairies, and I've never been to one where I thought the animals were treated well. All of them, cows give milk for the same reason humans give milk. They give milk for their babies. All of them have to keep them constantly impregnated, constant cycle of impregnation. All of them send them to slaughter. Almost all of them to the same massive slaughterhouses that all of the other dairy cows go to. All of them sell the babies to someone. They raise the females to add them back to the herd, but the males aren't going to give milk, so they take the males and they sell them oftentimes to veal operations, oftentimes to commercial veal operations, factory veal operations. And in general, the conditions are still pretty bad. Organic dairy means that they're not drugged up, which means they have to treat them a little bit better, but it's still generally not very good. And you don't need the milk. In the European Union, and every place that they've come up with mad cow disease, they've now banned feeding animals to animals. You can't feed pigs to pigs and chickens to chickens and cattle to cattle. You can't do it. You also can't slaughter any animal who's more than 30 months old. So dairy cows have to either be slaughtered before 30 months or they have to be fed to companion animals. They can't enter the human food chain as hamburger. In this country, yes. No, they can't be. No. In Europe, you can't feed agricultural animals back to herbivorous animals. So chickens, pigs, cattle, they're all vegetarians, every place that they've come up with mad cow disease. In this country, we're still feeding chickens to chickens and pigs to pigs. We're feeding cattle to chickens and pigs. And we're feeding cow's blood still to cattle. The one thing we did back in 1997 is we passed a law saying you can't feed ruminants to ruminants. So you can't feed cattle back to cattle, legally speaking. Last year, they got around to saying, I wonder if anybody's obeying this law. And they found that a third of the feed manufacturers were not labeling. So they were still feeding ruminants back to ruminants. But every place they've come up with mad cow disease, in the European Union, since 1990, the European Union has not allowed them to feed chickens to chickens and pigs to pigs and cattle to cattle. In this country, you can still feed cattle to pigs and then feed those pigs to cattle. You can feed chickens to chickens. Pretty much anything goes, except you can't directly feed cattle to cattle except cow's blood, which is exempted. You can still add cattle blood back to the feed of cattle, and the cattle can eat that, and the law hasn't been enforced, they determined last year when they got around to doing a survey. So, it's pretty much still an anything-goes scenario. And it could be a Chicken Little scenario. The sky really very much could be falling. Some scientists are speculating about the possibility of a spongy pig disease or spongy chicken disease. This stuff, the incubation period on bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, spongy bovine brain disease, the incubation period is very, very long. The only animals in Europe that they found it in are dairy animals, because all the other animals are slaughtered before this happens. And we aren't testing dairy animals at anything like the level that they're testing them in every other country where they found it. So it really could be a problem. We could have it in pigs, we could have it in chickens, we could have it in cattle. We wouldn't know. It was something that EarthSave International put together on the basis of John Robbins' first big vegan blockbuster book, which was called Diet for a New America. And I keep hearing they're going to do a new one on the basis of the food revolution. We may well do one for them if they don't, but it is packed with statistics. It's just, Ingrid, PETA's president, said it's the best book of the last 25 years, and I think that's true. It is the new sort of animal liberation, the way that it spells out just the horror of these industries. And I hope that EarthSave will do another copy of it based on the food revolution. With regard to the economic benefits of veganism, I don't know. I know there's a lot of controversy on this point, but I do think that veganism is becoming mainstream, and that capitalism is taking on veganism rather than sort of veganism taking on capitalism. But you do find that Boca Burger was bought out by Oscar Mayer, and Worthington, the other really wonderful vegan food manufacturer, was bought out by, who the heck bought out Worthington? RJR, no, that's also Oscar Mayer. I don't know. But in any event, you've got Silk brand soy milk in pretty much every grocery store in the country. Veganism has become mainstream. It's become easy for people. And I know a lot of people get dispirited and they think we're not making progress, but man, look at how it was 10 years ago compared to how it is today to be vegan. We're making astronomical, lightning speed progress by comparison to any other historical movement. And it's going to take people talking to all of their friends. One thing, don't ever say that veganism is your personal choice, that it's your personal decision. Think about the suffering of the animals on the factory farms. Think about the animals in the slaughterhouses. And no matter how uncomfortable you are talking to people about these issues, practice something into a mirror until you've got it down and you can say it. Carry the Why Vegans with you, or PETA's Vegetarian Starter Kit with you, and hand it to people who ask. But don't ever say it's your personal decision, because animals, the way that they're suffering on factory farms and in slaughterhouses, if they could speak up for themselves, they would, and they require you to do it. But it takes people, I think, in every area. What? No. Evidence that mad cow disease is in the United States is pretty overwhelming, and one of the pieces of that evidence is all of the animals, all of the deer and the elk who are coming down with spongy brain diseases. And we've been feeding those deer and those elk to agricultural animals, and still are, for years and years and years. And it seems that they got it probably by eating dead mink or dead sheep who had it. It's called scrapie in sheep. And I don't know what it's called in mink, but we definitely have the mink version of it here, and we have the sheep version of it here, and we have deer and elk version of it here, and yet the USDA would have us believe that we don't have the cattle version of it here. It seems pretty unlikely to an awful lot of people who are more intelligent than I am. Vegetarian movements, at least that's my understanding. Hitler popularized the idea of himself as a vegetarian, as an ascetic vegetarian who was only concerned with the promotion of the German people and the Third Reich. And he did a very good job of propaganda because his favorite foods all involved meat, and he wasn't a vegetarian. Rinberry actually has a really good piece up on vegsource.com that talks about that. But he did put himself in the place of what you're talking about, the vegetarians of his time. And there was also a strong ascetical vegetarian movement, myself included, believe that he was a part of that, and think that the evidence, there's just pretty much overwhelming evidence to indicate that that was the case. But the ascetical movement seems to have flourished at times when you would have expected the ascetics to sort of be around, like especially immediately after World War I. The idea of vegetarianism, largely up until this century, was the idea of self-denial. So you would eat bread and water, or you would eat, just bread and fruits and nuts and that sort of thing. And a lot of the biblical, not the biblical, but like the Desert Fathers, the writings, the extra biblical writings from the first 300 years after Jesus died, for the first 300 years after that, they were talking about asceticism. We live only on this, that, and the other thing. And it was the same thing that Hitler talked about in promoting the idea that he was a vegetarian. It was an ascetical ideal. And certainly that's the same thing with Sylvester Graham, building slaughterhouses on reservations right now and co-opting the legitimate governments in order to do it. It's certainly yet another thing that the meat and dairy interests are doing to hurt human beings. I mean, I don't know how many people read it, but Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser details the way that especially immigrant communities are, used by the meat and dairy industries, who will go and recruit in Mexico and Central America, bust the people up to the slaughterhouses, and then if they get out of line at all, or they get injured and try to claim workers' comp, they call the INS and say, we just discovered, this guy is an illegal immigrant, you need to take him back, and boom, he's in the county jail being deported. They certainly have no shame and are perfectly willing to hurt human beings. There was an amazing report, in addition to the Schlosser, where he talks about 300% turnover rates in a lot of these slaughterhouses, 9 times the injury rate of coal miners in Appalachia, and all this sort of thing. There was an interesting report done by the Center for Public Integrity called Safety Last, where they talked about the fact that 6,000 people with compromised immune systems drop over dead every year from contaminated meat, and there are about 80 million cases of foodborne illness, according to the CDC. Now, this is astronomically higher on a percentage basis than anything that's happening in Europe or Australia or New Zealand, and the reason for it is that the meat and dairy industries are so powerful. They bought off everybody at the USDA. They bought off the people in the Senate and House Agricultural Committees. Nobody talks about this better than Howard Lyman, I don't think, who was a lobbyist for a while. Thought he was going to go and explain to everybody in Congress what he knows to be true, and of course they'll do the right thing, and that they have no interest in doing the right thing, which is how come I think that it really does come down to people like us, who speak out when people ask us and take whatever spare time we have and whatever spare resources we have to try to promote the compassionate vegan world that we know is inevitable. At this moment has a modicum of dairy products in it. The burger itself is vegan. The bun, and this was an accident on the part of the people at Burger King, because their reformulation people reformulated all of their buns, I guess, about 6 months ago, and so they were promoting it for about that long as a vegan burger. Everybody I know in the key vegan movement is supporting and eating it. Eric Marcus, who wrote Vegan, The New Ethics of Eating, Howard Lyman, our friend, Alex Hersheft at Farm, for whom Laura Lee works, the people at Vegan Outreach, the people at Vegan Action, and the people at PETA. And our reason for supporting and eating it is that we think it needs to succeed, and we think that really the idea of saying that anything can be... Veganism isn't about dogma, right? Veganism is about an ethic of compassion. Everything involves some suffering. You know, if we eat anything packaged, if we eat anything not organic, and you can go both ways. You can say, if you eat anything not organic, then you're supporting pesticides and herbicides, which are killing animals. And if you're eating anything that is organic, then you're supporting using fertilizer, which comes from animals. I mean, it just gets silly. And since this is a product that probably contains no calories in the bun, and that they're working on getting out of the bun, we think it's worth continuing to support. All the way in the back? There's a market for the fertilizer that a lot of the organic gardens are using that fertilizer. It really, I think, comes down to a degree, to recognizing that none of us can be perfect. And that's, everybody here who's a vegetarian has had somebody point at your shoes and say, are those leather? Or somebody say, do you drive a car? Well, then do you ride in a car? Well, then, there are going to be elements of everything that we do, I think, that are going to be ethically problematic. And hopefully this doesn't mean that just because we can't do everything, we settle down into our apathy and do nothing. I think that, again, what veganism is about is it's about doing the best we can. And as far as I can tell, there's never any reason to sit down and eat an animal product. There's never any reason to wear leather or to wear fur. Veganstore.com, fancy smancy shoes and belt. It seems to me that we do the best that we can, and that some of us are going to draw our lines in areas that are different from others, but I can't come up with a reason that would ever justify eating meat or dairy or eggs or wearing leather. Sorry. It's with somebody if you're eating with them. And it is tough, and it's so situational, and especially with somebody who you're going to be having a lot of meals with. I think if somebody asks you the question, you're duty-bound to answer it. And I think that, obviously, as we all know, hackles are going to rise very, very quickly in many situations. And I think we need to recognize that and practice something along the lines of, I find that when I have this conversation with people while they're eating meat, they oftentimes can't hear me. And I've got a book that I would like you to read, or a pamphlet I would like you to read, or a video I would like you to watch. And this is very important to me. I don't believe it's a personal choice. The animal didn't have any say in what you're doing to them. Saying that it's a personal choice is saying child abuse is a personal choice. And this is an issue that's very serious for me. And I'd like to talk to you about it in a setting where, both of us can be honest and open and not get defensive or angry or whatever else. And sometimes people hear that and sometimes they don't hear that. But I think it's important that we try and that we say to, especially the people we love, I know that you love me, and I really hope that you'll read this brochure, and I hope that you'll let us, have a conversation about it, because it's really essential to who I am. And, have no illusions that sometimes isn't going to work, because people have been doing things for 30 or 50, are in deep denial. And we owe it to the animals, and we owe it to ourselves as ethical people to try to break those barriers down, and you do the best you can. Did you? And I don't know how much of that research was supported by the meat and dairy industries. They don't promote too much. They don't do too much of their own research, but they do employ their own nutritionists to spin the research and to say, no, this isn't conclusive. Just like the tobacco industry, spins the research and says, no, this isn't conclusive, and that sort of thing. But, the proof is in the pudding. The two people who have unclogged people's arteries have both done it with a low-fat vegan diet. Vegans have cholesterol levels that are much lower, before you even get into the whole proportionality thing, that are much lower than ovo-lacto vegetarians. And people with cholesterol levels at the levels vegans have them, by and large, don't die from heart attacks, which kills about half of people in this country. So, there is a lot of truth to the saturated fat thing. You can shoot your cholesterol up into, well over 200 as a vegan. If you're eating, lots and lots of fried foods and lots of, the soybean oil spread, whatever else. But it's hard to do. It's hard to do. I haven't found any vegans with a cholesterol level above 150, although I know that they exist. And I just want to, in closing, say thank you all so much for turning up. Thank you for being part of the vegan revolution. One of the great things about the animal rights movement is you don't have to send a check. You don't have to sign a form. You don't have to give anybody your contact information. You just choose a vegan diet the next time you sit down to eat. Martin Luther King Jr. said one of the great tragedies of history is that so many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change. If you're out today, you're awake through the great period of social change, and I salute you. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.